participants and do not allow them to unmute themselves. Your kitten's going. Kitten, Daddy wants you. Well, he didn't sit on the chair and go, "Come here, kitten." He might have come.
Oi! Oi!
Oh, it's not this recording. All right, let's do it. Hello to all the people who are entering the Avid Reader space. If you can imagine a chilly but lovely evening, a little bit overcast here in Brisbane, and out on the back deck at Avid Reader, it is we're all shoulder to shoulder, so nobody is really cold. It's very Brisbane balmy winter. So welcome everybody. We are just waiting for a couple of last people to join us before we actually kick off. But as I'm just waiting, I'll let you know a couple of things. The first one is that if you are new to Zoom, and let's face it, most of you use it every day of your life at the moment, but if you're new to it, there are different ways to view, and that's up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So you'll be able to click that button, which has like lots of dots next to each other, and you'll be able to click that and it'll change your view. So you can either see all of the guests or you can see one person speaking at a time. I recommend the one person speaking at a time because that's much easier to see what's going on. So trial that one. The other thing is that we will be taking questions tonight if you do have any. So if you do have any questions, there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Now I'm just putting the link to the book from tonight in the chat box. So there is the link to purchase the book from tonight, and that's where you can find it. That's also where you can put your questions. And as I've said in the chat box, for tonight, for the people on our event, there is a 10% discount for anything you buy at our web store. So please use the word event, E-V-E-N-T, at the checkout and you will get 10% off, which is fantastic. So do go shopping after the event tonight. I think that we have most of our people in. People will be joining us throughout the evening, but I will start with my introductions now. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of Aboriginal people. In this area, it's the Yagara and the Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are with us tonight. I'd also like to mention that we are zooming out onto the lands of many different language groups, and I'd like to pay my respects to all of the elders of the language groups of the lands on which we're zooming to. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. Now, tonight, it's my incredible pleasure to welcome both Annika and Paul to Avid Reader. This is a really important subject that we're talking about tonight, and I personally am excited to be in the room. But our host for tonight will be Paul Barclay, who is a journalist, presenter, writer, and judge of many literary awards, including the Walkleys from time to time. Paul is also the producer of Radio National's Big Ideas, and that is what he is recording for tonight. So welcome to Paul Barclay.
Thanks, Chrissy. It's great to be here once again from Studio 402 at the ABC in Brisbane for this Avid Reader conversation, and great to welcome Annika. Most of us in the journalism, or in my case, broadcasting caper, know what it's like to land a big story, or at least to ruffle a few feathers of someone important by just doing our job. Annika reminds us in her essay on secrets, that's this one here, by the way, that one of the best descriptions of news is that it is, quote, something which somebody else wants suppressed. All the rest is advertising. That quote, by the way, comes from William Randolph Hearst, the US newspaper tycoon who forms the basis for the lead character in the movie Citizen Kane. Annika landed one of those big news stories that somebody else wanted suppressed. It was a report in the Sunday Telegraph newspaper revealing a proposal to expand the powers of an Australian spy agency. The article was published, duly upset a few people, and then nothing much happened until a year later, over a year later, in the middle of last year, out of the blue, with no warning, her home was raided by 5 federal police officers on a cold Canberra morning. She was told not long afterwards by her lawyers that she faced the possibility of years in prison for being in breach of Australia's secrecy laws. Needless to say, the whole ordeal was stressful and difficult, but also got Annika thinking about the state of press freedom in Australia. Annika Smethurst is the author of On Secrets, published by Hachette. She's also a Walkley Award-winning journalist and the political editor of the Daily Telegraph. And she joins us on Zoom. Hello, Annika.
Great to be with you, Paul. Thank you for that introduction.
You too. We should begin, I think, with the story that got you into the hot water in the first place. It was, as I said, a proposal to increase the power of the Australian Signals Directorate. Who are they and what was being proposed?
Look, we do have a lot of different spy agencies, and as you'd expect, a lot of them operate in the shadows. I guess ASIO is the most well-known one to most Australians, but we do have about 6 different agencies, and they all have different remits and have different responsibilities. And ASD, the Australian Signals Directorate, are our cyber spies. And of course, given the world we live in, that's increasingly important. Their motto since World War II, when they first came about, is to protect our secrets, you know, to defend Australians from foreign threats. They're not meant to look at Australians. They're meant to find foreigners overseas doing wrong and, you know, go after them. I realised that this was something the government was thinking of changing. And usually, I guess a lot of people say that, and I get this argument quite a lot, that if you haven't done anything wrong, why should it matter that they want to expand the powers and have cyber spies look at us? And that's one argument, and I completely get that. But it was a huge shift, I guess, in the role of a defence agency that is run by defence. They're meant to defend us, just like the army, from foreigners, not turn those powers on us. And that was something, you know, I guess I wanted the public to know.
And at the very least, something worthy of debate in a democracy, such an increase in the remit of an organisation that, as you say, in the past didn't have the ability to check on the computer databases of Australian citizens.
Yeah, and there are agencies that can look into Australians. The AFP came to my house and did that very thing. ASIO, it's not that we let Aussies get away with terrible behaviour. There's some really dodgy people here, and you know, we have thankfully really good national security agencies that protect us. But this was a monumental shift in I guess, how the agencies operate. There is a watchdog for security agencies. Margaret Stone's the woman that's, I guess, the overseer of all the, and she had advised against this very broadly at a few years prior. So even she, in her position, who understands how these agencies worked, had suggested this wasn't something that should be good. The government had sort of said this was to go after pedophiles and other things. No, on the general consent, the idea of what was being proposed, I don't take a really strong view either way, but I think it's something Australians should know, that with a warrant that would be overseen by a minister, you know, not the usual judicial processes, very powerful cyber spooks could see our bank accounts, our text messages without us even knowing. And I think Australians have a right to know that. We give up a lot to have a really safe, you know, Australia, and our national security laws have protected us in many ways. But if we're giving up freedoms, I think we should be able to have that fight.
And from your essay, it seemed to be the case that Peter Dutton and Maurice Payne supported, in principle, the expansion of these powers, but Malcolm Turnbull and Julie Bishop, on the other hand, opposed it, which indicates that the government was quite split on this proposal.
Peter Dutton especially supported it. Maurice Payne, it came from the head of her department. So to think that she didn't know, I guess, there could be argued that this was sort of bureaucratic boffins having this argument. But if the head of your department is having this issue with you not knowing about it, that's a problem in itself. Malcolm Turnbull definitely wasn't in favour of it, nor was Julie Bishop. I believe Christopher Pyne even had issues with it at the time, and he had quite an important portfolio. So after the story I wrote, my understanding is that they had a fight in cabinet and they said it's not going to go ahead. That has changed now. There's been some softening up of this sort of idea. We've had the AFP come out and talk about it, ASIO, a few other agencies, to try and get Australians on board with it. And look, it's an argument that should be in the public. This has always been my thing. I don't have a sort of moral stance on this as such. If they can justify to Australians that this is what we need to fight the baddies, then great. But to do it without our knowledge and to try and sneak these things through, I think is incredibly wrong.
Suffice to say, it's a big story and an important story. And sometimes when you get hold of what you know is a hot story, one that has to be legaled, you know the subject of the story is not going to be happy about the fact that you're onto it and you're going to publish it, you get that sense that there could be some nasty blowback, possibly a defamation writ is the most common response when you're on this kind of ground. Did you have any feeling about that before the story went to the press, that this could be a problem for you?
I'm not naive enough to think that I would just write this, put it on the front of the biggest selling papers in the Sunday tabloids for News Corp across Australia and then just go on with my life. I did think that there'd be a bit of, well, where the hell did she find this out and who has she been talking to? That has happened from time to time. And one story I mentioned in the book is Laurie Oakes getting an amazing cabinet leak under the Rudd government about the Fuel Watch program. And he had received leaks from department heads, which was quite high up. Rudd was furious. They sent the AFP to investigate. The head of the AFP rang Laurie one day and said, do you still have the document that was, you used for this story? And he said, the document doesn't exist. And it went away. The AFP had done their due diligence and followed up the accusations, and Laurie had done his in protecting his source, and everybody moved on. So look, I probably didn't think it would be that easy, but within 24 hours, Malcolm Turnbull announced that they would call in the AFP for a leak. They have to do this every time, I guess, a cabinet leak gets on the front of the paper. They seem to happen every week. Nothing comes of them. So it's kind of an understanding amongst journalists that there will be an investigation, but I did not anticipate that a year later and 2 years later, I'd still be going through sort of the emotional turmoil and threat of court that ended up happening.
What can you tell us about how you got the story? Obviously, there's much that you can't tell us about how you got the story. I appreciate you're constrained in that respect. But did, for example, is it on the record that it was a whistleblower who provided you with this information?
Look, one man's whistleblower is, somebody else's not whistleblower.
Well, yeah,
so I find it hard to define that. Look, it's a story I'd love to write, in an All the President's Men type of way about how you come across these sort of stories. Unfortunately, it's not something I can tell, because while the police have dropped any charges against me and won't be going after a whistleblower at the moment, I'm sure the moment I say something on radio that could give them a leg up, they'd do something. Look, I think one mistake a lot of people make is talking about whistleblowers and generally is that journalists get stories from one person. You might hear a tidbit over here and then you're like, that's interesting. Well, who would know that? So you go and talk to another person, and then you might get a little bit there, and then you go somewhere else. In this story, I spoke to a number of people. I understood the sensitivity. Some people helped, some people didn't. Some people told me, don't write that story. So look, it's never sort of, someone obviously gives you the juicy bit that goes, I've got it enough now. That's enough. There always is that sort of source, but very few journalists would be confident enough speaking to one person, because as Malcolm Turnbull learnt with Ugate so many years ago, sometimes that your sources aren't reliable. And if you go in all in behind them, that doesn't really, bode well for you.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to double check, sometimes triple check your information. So what law or laws was it that you were allegedly in breach of?
That's an interesting question, because there was some laws listed on the warrant, and they came to my house and they said, we think you're in breach of these. And when I won the High Court case to say that the warrant was actually invalid, one of the issues with the warrant was they weren't clear enough about which law I was alleged to have broken. But talking about the Crimes Act in general, there is one part of the Crimes Act that says if you get any information sent to you which is classified in certain ways, there's lots of classifications, but even if you get that information, it lands in your inbox, you're in breach of the Crimes Act. It goes back to sort of, World War II days, where they didn't want, and it's an espionage stuff. They didn't want the Germans sort of being able to access information. So it's quite an old, archaic law. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a place now, but I guess given the modern technology, it probably does need to be updated. There's also was a second allegation around national security, that perhaps I was giving Australians information that put Australians at risk. Now, this is something that really, I guess, sat uncomfortably with me. I take my job as a journalist seriously, and this is why I often make a distinction between some of the stuff WikiLeaks has done, because just getting a trove of information about it and turning it into a story, I guess, I would never write a story that said where Australian SAS troops were based or something like this. I've been to Iraq. I went with the defence minister, and there were things that they said don't write, and I didn't write. I understand the need for national security laws. I don't think anything I wrote in this story put Australians at risk, because if they had have wanted this change, and if they do want to get this change through, it will have to pass Parliament. So it's something Australians will have to know anyway.
Sorry, Annika, did anybody dispute the accuracy of the story? Was the truth of the story ever an issue?
It's funny you say that. It's a trick that Trump often uses, that you find a little bit in it that perhaps you don't agree with or hasn't been contextualized, and you use that to discredit the whole story. There's a number of hearings that went on afterwards, and Michael Pizzullo, the head of the Home Affairs Department, said I was a pretty, to verbal him, I wasn't a very good journalist and I'd misunderstood this whole story and I've got it completely wrong. Well, that's not true. They've basically admitted they're going to try and, bring this law in at some point. Peter Dutton has said that. But I guess they didn't like, the headline. We don't write, I write the headlines. But, to put it in context, I'm writing for a tabloid audience on a major national masthead, which is going to be very different to a briefing document given to a department secretary. So, yes, the language is possibly different, but the story was never disputed in the sense of what they were trying to do. It was correct. They just didn't like how it was written up.
And as you say, it ended up in the High Court. You challenged the legality of the warrant. Did you need to prepare a legal defence against the allegations themselves? And if so, what was your actual defence?
It was interesting. We didn't get to that stage in the court, but we were prepared to. We were prepared to run a free press argument. I'd never been to court before, and my first, I've never had a sort of drunk driving or speeding fine that's ended up in court, and my first appearance was in the High Court in front of 7 justices, and it was terrifying.
Bloody hell.
But yeah, it's pretty formal there. Look, we were pretty strong on this being, in the public's right to know, which is something courts can consider. Does the public have a right to know this? We felt strong on that, and we also felt strong on a press freedom sort of argument, and also that we didn't endanger anybody, that this information by being out there didn't. We never actually got to run any of those arguments because we basically won, because the warrant was poorly written and, didn't go into the depths of what I was alleged to have done, which was a win for me. And I got a lot of sort of congratulatory messages when I had a High Court win. I hear that's a good thing. And for all young law students, apparently Smethurst v Commissioner of the Police is a very interesting case. But for me, I was furious because I'd won in court and they got to keep all the information they took. And I'd only done year 12 legal studies, but I just thought, this is absurd. If they came into my house and took my couch or my oven or my fridge, they'd have to return it. They came in illegally. It was trespass. And I was really frustrated because it didn't actually advance the case. And it was a win on a technicality. It didn't do anything for freedom of press in Australia. And after all the sort of emotional turmoil I'd been through, it didn't help the cause, and it won't help any young journos coming through behind me.
We'll talk a bit about the emotional turmoil in a moment. Do you believe, though, that the government or the Attorney General should have intervened to ensure that you weren't prosecuted, to ensure that you were not placed in the position that you were placed in simply by doing your job?
Look, that's an interesting one because a lot of people sort of blamed the government. Once the police had raided my house, it became very difficult for the government to intervene because we do have a separation of powers. And should Christian Porter have said, no, I step in, put Annika, to aside, protect her, this is not how we work in this country, it would have been, whilst welcomed by me and many of my supporters, an intrusion, and that set a very dangerous precedent. So I understood the government's predicament. And privately, I work at Parliament House, I get in lifts, I stand in the coffee line next to members of the coalition government, and it was difficult because I try and be impartial, and these people were, their government was chasing me in court, funded by the government solicitors. So, it was a difficult predicament I was in, but I had a lot of support from cabinet ministers saying, I don't agree with this is outrageous. But once it got to that level, I guess it was a problem. Since then, the government has put in sort of, not laws, but there are requirements that the AFP have to think about should a journalist be on the line. And I welcome those. There's sort of more guidelines and ministerial directions. There's still no set in stone protections. But no, I actually, even though it would have helped me, I think it would have been wrong for Christian Porter to step in and seem to be intervening in a very significant case, because the precedent that sets would be terribly worrying.
You're looking pretty relaxed as you talk about this tonight now. You've written the essay. I suppose it's given you that ability to clarify some thoughts and to get some distance. And as journalists, we're very good about writing things and somehow creating a distance between what we write and what happened. But let's be clear about this. This was an incredibly stressful thing that you went through. Let's just talk about the raid itself and the aftermath. What were you doing, Annika, when that knock on the door happened?
Oh my goodness. I had been so it was June last year, 2019. And of course we had an election in May. And I had been on the road covering an election, and there are incredible things to cover. You sort of either get billeted to one plane or the other, Labor or the Liberals, and you fly around the country. You can go to 3 states in one day. You don't know where you are. You get to see quite a bit of the country and get an understanding of what's going on, but it's like a bubble. So I'd been doing that, and I'd come home and the government had won. So I'd been doing media all over the country. I really had not spent a lot of time at my Canberra apartment at all. And I popped home at 9 a.m. one morning. I probably hadn't been there in 10 days. And within half an hour of me arriving, I had a knock at the door. And I'd been reminded by a reminder in my phone, because that's the only way anything gets organised in my life, is that a carpet cleaner was coming over because I had a stain on the carpet from some red wine, which I cover in the book. And so I opened the door and it was the police. And that might all sound like boring background information, but the context of that was I hadn't been home for 10 days. I'd been texting a carpet cleaner to say I'll be home that morning to let them in. And that was the day the police chose to arrive. And I guess that always worried me because it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like I had been watched, or they'd been listening to my phone calls, which is probably what they were doing. And my lawyers suggested that and have been listening up until recently, probably still are, I don't know. But I felt so violated by that, not just for me, but for the people that choose to talk to me, my friends, my family, my parents, my partner. They trust that when they're talking to me, no one else is listening. And that wasn't the case. And it felt awful. So it was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. 5 police showed up. Once they knew I was home, 2 more came. So they were only, the AFP headquarters are only just around the corner. 2 more IT experts came. And I naively said to them, oh, I've got a carpet cleaner coming around, like they didn't know. How long is this going to take? Thinking they might just ask me a couple of questions and be gone. Will he still be able to come? Because I've had trouble keeping this appointment. And they said, no, you're going to need to tell him to go. So eventually the carpet cleaner did rock up, and there were 7 police and news cameras out the front. And I just said to him, I'm sorry, the police are here, you're going to have to go. So I was so naive on the day about the consequences and the impact this would have. I actually genuinely thought maybe nobody will find out. I'll go to work and I'll go, well, guess what happened to me this morning? Some police came over. That is not at all what happened. The New York Times rang me within half an hour. It was being played on the BBC. It was
international
people
news.
I knew in France got in touch, and I'm quite a control freak. I like to I don't like to worry people. I really hate upsetting and worrying people. I'm always I'd prefer to take a hit to not upset others. And I had to relinquish control all of a sudden and know that people who love and care about me were hearing about this on the news and couldn't get in touch, including my parents.
Many
really
people
awful.
will know, Annika, that the following day, the ABC was raided and two ABC investigative journalists, Dan Oakes and Sam Clark, came to the attention of the federal police as well. There's a couple of differences, though. One is that is still going on, that matter, unfortunately for those journalists. Secondly, though, the ABC had been informed in advance that the raid was going to take place. You had not the slightest idea that you were about to be raided, or that your story had been so examined to the extent that you'd come, that far under the attention of the feds.
Absolutely, and that's what I get shocked about. I knew that AFP had investigated a year before, but I thought that must have ended. No one told me in that whole year that this had got to a different level, which goes to my concerns about being listened to, because I don't know how long that was going on before the actual raid occurred, or whether the raid was done to trigger a conversation on my phone for me to tip off a whistleblower or something like this, that maybe they weren't actually after anything. They were after conversations after the fact. That was terribly worrying too. Look, and people ask why didn't they come to my workplace? Sam and Dan, who I know at the ABC, and I stand by 100%, they obviously went to their workplace. Now, my issue was my office is in Parliament House. Yeah. And should they have had to come to Parliament House, they would have had to tip off or get approval from the Speaker and from the President of the Senate. And that would have put the government in a tricky position. So I suspect that's why they didn't come to my office. We know they did have a third raid planned for that week. I don't know why they thought it would be a good idea to do this all in 1 week at News Corp, but they pulled out at the last minute, and some say it's political pressure, others because they were worried about the validity of the warrant. We'd already said we were going to challenge it. Or maybe, they just saw that day 3 of raids that was hitting the international news while Scott Morrison was visiting the Queen, maybe that wasn't a good idea.
So these five police officers knock on your door, say that they're coming to search your house. Do they make it clear instantly what it is that they're looking for and what this matter is about?
It's weird. Once they were there, my mind didn't question for a minute what they were there for. I'm not running some sort of child sex ring or, anything else the AFP look into, money, fraud, or I don't know. I knew what they were there for, and they had a copy of the story. They had a copy of the story and they had a warrant, and they said, can we come in and speak to you? So look, I'm told in hindsight, I didn't have to let them in until I had a lawyer present, but I'm polite. So I decided to let them in, thinking maybe I could sweet talk them out of this. And we all sat around my dining room table. I remember holding the warrant and trying not to let them see me shake, because I didn't want them to see that I was upset. But when you get that rush of adrenaline, and I was very overcome, and I realised very quickly this is something beyond my pay grade, and I needed to get some lawyers there pretty quickly.
Yeah. I remember once when I was on a family holiday with my partner and the kids, and I got a phone call from the neighbour that the house had been broken into, that they'd heard some noise, heard the dog barking, heard the window being smashed. So I came home, left the family there to just check out what had happened, and came into this house where things had been stolen, the window had been smashed. I called the police came around. Then I had to spend the night in the house before I went back to the family holiday. And there'd be plenty of people who have a similar feeling to that. They know what it's like when the house has been broken into, that sense of intrusion, and that sense of just violation. You had your mobile phone taken from you by the federal police officers. They asked you for the code, and they went through all of your private text messages. Tell us about that and how you felt at that moment.
Look, that's so interesting you say that violation. I had a friend in Brisbane, actually, who had been robbed a couple of years prior, and she kept saying, I couldn't stay in the house. And I was, it didn't make sense to me. She'd had the locks changed. You know, these people were clearly not, weren't known to her. It was just a random burglary. And I thought, this is absurd. But until you've been through that, I guess, I now feel silly saying that, because it is such an awful thing. Your home is your oasis. And I didn't have as public a profile as I do now, but I did TV and I was a bit of a well-known journalist in the press gallery, and, you know, recognised a little bit around Canberra. So I guess going back to my very modest 2-bedroom 70s apartment, as a lot of Canberra apartments are, I loved it. You know, it was just this place. It was the first place I'd lived alone, moved there in my late 20s. I'd always had housemates, and it was my home. And to have police go through, as you say, my phone, but also my personal belongings, letters my grandparents had written me, things like this, I couldn't stay there another minute. And the phone, at the risk of sounding like a total millennial, the phone wasn't so much about, you know, I don't know, worrying about the state secrets. It is things my friends had shared with me, texts my mum had sent me that were meant to be just between us, photos, little notes I'd made, maybe I'd screenshotted a dress I wanted to buy. Like,
yeah, I know.
the shopping lists, like, it's just so stupid. But these are my, you know, these are things you don't even show your partner necessarily. It's just your little world. And I write it in the book, and I forget the exact words, but afterwards my partner came home and I was barbecuing some birthday cards and letters my grandmother and other people, old love letters or friendships, things that people had sent me that I kept in a box. And he's like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm just so worried they'll come back and read these again. And all the sentiment had been lost. You know, when someone sends you something privately and you receive it, it's just between you and the person that wrote it. And all of a sudden they didn't have the same meaning now that some stranger from the AFP had read them. So, and I regret burning a lot of those things. I shouldn't have done it, but I was so unhinged at the time that it was the only response I knew.
Well, you quickly decided that you were never going to live in that apartment again.
Yes, which is sad. I loved that place, but I was worried it was bugged. You know, the cops had been there for 7 hours. I couldn't keep an eye on them the whole time. I hear bugging devices are quite small. I assume they probably bugged it. I don't know. Maybe they didn't. But they had been there. There was media on my lawn, which I shouldn't be disparaging of, because I have also been a journalist on a stakeout and sat on people's lawns. But one of the photographers who I knew outside said that at one stage during the day, somebody drove past and yelled out their window, oh, so that's where Annika Smethurst lives, because this was sort of live on News 24 and things. And by that stage, I was living there alone, and I just thought, I can't stay here. Everybody knows where I live now, and I just feel totally embarrassed and mortified. And, you know, I moved in with my partner, but even if I hadn't, if I would have got my own place or stayed in a hotel for a few nights, or I don't know, I couldn't spend another night there. Yeah,
I totally get that. I mentioned earlier that your lawyers told you not long after the raid that the alleged offence that the AFP were pursuing you over had a potential jail term of years. I think it was 2 to 5 years attached to it. I mean, that's very, very scary indeed. Just talk us through, if you can, the psychological impact of all this and the whole ordeal and what it did to you, and whether you have any residual anxiety as a result.
Oh, such a big question. I'm a journalist, and I've realised that lawyers don't like to give direct answers, ever. Bless them, that's their job. I would constantly ask, what are our chances of winning? You know, I wanted a percentage. I wanted things like this, and they would just give me a sort of vague answers. But I made it really clear on the day I was raided. I said, what am I facing? And they said, oh, well, we won't let it get to that. First, we're going to do this. And I said, no, I need to know. Like, you know, I need to prepare myself. And when they said 2 to 5 years, I genuinely went, all right, well, I could probably get away with 2. I'm 31, you know, I won't waste my life in there. I'll write a book. I'll get really fit. You know, like, I started bargaining with myself, and I think it was a way to accept it, because then if it did happen, I was like, well, I'm prepared for this. But I remember thinking 5 was not acceptable, and I did not want to spend 5 years in jail. I genuinely woke up every day for a year thinking, today's the day they come back. I couldn't answer the door for about 3 months. I had probably not had as much sympathy, I guess, for people that had been through things like this and the anxiety they can feel. I understood it, but I'm not as sort of viscerally as perhaps I do now. And I wouldn't want anyone else going through that in order to gain that understanding. But I try and see that good things can come out of bad situations. And for me, I write a lot about people who are either going through the best of times or the worst of times. As a journalist, you're either talking to people when they've won a gold medal or, become prime minister or been put into cabinet, or they've had some bloody terrible tragedy come upon them. And often they don't want to be thrown into the news. And that was me. So I hope that helps my reporting, and that I'm more sympathetic now and have a greater understanding of how to tell those stories. But a lot of people would try and do what I would have done and say, Annika, you're not going to go to jail. It's not going to come to this, But every morning for 58 days, I woke up thinking, okay, today's the day I'm going to go to jail. And I tried to just get on with life. And a lot of it was about pretending. And you hear people say this after someone's died, fake it till you make it, routine, just keep going. And one day it won't feel this way. So I did, and I just kept going to work and kept trying to do things. I remember being at a friend's wedding and I was their bridesmaid, and this was meant to be a very happy occasion, and it was, but I just didn't feel like I could enjoy it like I should. It just felt like there was a 70 or 60% enjoyment and the rest of it was blurred. And I was so angry for that, because it felt like I was already serving a sentence for that whole year, because I just didn't get to live. I was just sort of in this anxiety and this waiting. And that's what Dan is going through at the ABC now. At one stage I actually thought, well, just charge me and then we can go to court and fast track this, because I genuinely thought for a while they may never clear me of this. It could just sit there. Well, it's an open investigation. 10 years later, we're still just waiting and we're still listening to our phone calls, and it's just going to hang over your head for the rest of your life. And I remember thinking I'd almost prefer to be charged, go to court, do 2 years, get out and start a life again.
Absolutely. You write that you miss your old life, that you mourn what it is that you've lost. What do you feel it is that you've lost since that?
I wouldn't say I was naive. I don't think anybody that is a press gallery journalist is naive. I think if you've done that in your career and come to Canberra, you can't be naive. But I had an innocence that I definitely don't have now. I'm not as trusting. I don't trust the police as much. I know they still do amazing things. I lost my wallet recently in Canberra and they were very helpful. The AFP came around and asked me my name and I sort of whispered it, Annika, sorry. So it's not that I don't trust all police and things like this. It's just, I find it hard to sort of find somebody that I really trust to the level I did before this. I've lost my anonymity, and some people, some journalists might have loved that. It's been put to me that it's probably been the best thing for my career, and that might be true in some senses, but it's not in the other. I questioned quitting a number of times during the year. I remember I got a puppy during the year, thank God, because it was the only thing that got me up some mornings. But I used to drop him at sort of like a puppy play centre occasionally, and they had a sign there for a job, and I thought, I think I'd be happier doing that, and something that I'd worked my whole life towards doing is having a journalism career and being a press gallery reporter, and I couldn't find love in it anymore. And even now I still question, I know I want to do journalism, but I have really sort of deep thoughts about which direction that should go in, and maybe that's a blessing, and it's a lesson I'm lucky I learnt now, but also I feel deep anger that this is something that's come upon me and I've been forced to have this decision now. And I didn't want to have those big thoughts in my head. And also I've just lost being, pardon me, I've lost my anonymity. I was in bloody Country Road the other day and I went to pay for something and the woman asked me if I was a member, and she goes, because I know who you are. And it happens at the post office, it happens at the pub when I'm dressed with no makeup on, and people are always lovely, but I just want to go have a beer sometimes or buy a scarf without being, accosted and having to talk about that terrible year I had and put on a brave face.
Yeah, you say that when you were in the midst of it, you heard just about every joke about prison under the sun. You must have got really sick of prison jokes.
You have no idea. And I've realised how Aussies do it, and I'm probably guilty of it too, but we often don't know how to say things when people have bad things that happen. So we joke. And look, sometimes it helps because I wasn't up to always having a serious conversation about it too. So sometimes laughter is the best way to just sort of move on. I remember a federal Labor MP saying to me, oh, haven't they locked you up yet? Or where's your AFP detail? And I remember being really angry this night. I'd run into him at a restaurant and I just wanted to go out and have dinner. We had a quick chat at the door and I just thought, I just wanted to forget about this for tonight. And this Labor MP was senior and had just lost the election. And I didn't joke about that. You know, even I knew that there were limits, that this person was probably hurting given the effort they'd put into winning that election. And I would never say, aren't you meant to be living in the lodge or, you know, minister for this person or on the front bench? I was never going to say that because I know that that was sort of too soon. But people did not stop saying that sort of stuff to me. I wore a green jumpsuit once to work and people were saying, oh, you're already in the prison gear. And I'd always go, oh, yes, great joke.
Not
and
fun
inside I was dying. I was just like, you're not going to be laughing when I am in jail. And, you know, I just wanted to have 10 minutes where I didn't think about it in a day because my head was already there. It was on the front of newspapers. If I got in the car and turned on the radio, somebody was talking about it, which is good. I want people to talk about press freedom. But, you know, I just sometimes wanted to get a coffee and line up in the queue without having to discuss my impending jail sentence.
You know, in our business, Annika, in the business of being in the media, you write for high-profile publications and I'm on the ABC. Confidence is such an important part of what we do. You know, you have to believe that there's someone who wants to read your stories and that they're important, or that in my case, that someone wants to listen to the radio program. How has your confidence as a journalist been affected by all of this?
Smashed. And you're so right. You're the first person that said that to me. And I think you've pinpointed it actually, that not only did I have a story I'd written trigger this response, which personally, you know, my parents were so worried and it was just, I thought I've put all my friends and family and loved ones through such stress and that hit my confidence. But in running through the media was a question about whether the story was accurate. And I knew it was accurate. And that was probably something that upset me the most. You know, there were Senate estimates hearings where they're now written into Hansard of Parliament, where people have questioned my ability to do my job, my ability to understand documents, just called me a terrible journalist. And my whole life hinged on that. And maybe it's a good thing now that I've sort of tried to realize that it doesn't define me being a journalist. But I'd worked so hard and I was so angry that people were having a public debate about should I go to jail or not? Was I correct? Was I even right? Did I make this up? I didn't make it up. Like I wasn't going to go to jail over a made up story. And I've been proven correct now, but I guess that doesn't matter. It took a huge toll. And as you say, you have to feel confident. You know, you might sit there and watch Lee Sales interview the Prime Minister or watch these press conferences that have happened through COVID and think I could stand there and ask the Prime Minister a tough question. It's hard. And you do actually have to back yourself. And especially when you're a young woman, your voice often isn't as strong. And there's some real, you know, hard hitters in the gallery that have been there forever. And you go to a press conference with them and you have to really back yourself. And often you get tricks back. You know, ministers will say, well, no, you're wrong. And you have to know your stuff. And it genuinely has hurt my career. It might have boosted it in some ways, but it has really hit my confidence.
Do you feel that the raid on your flat and then the Damocles sword that was hanging over your head for a year or so was a form of intimidation, as in it was designed to send a message to other reporters that if you start publishing stories of this ilk, you can expect the same treatment?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the worst thing. We can't quantify the stories that weren't told in the last year because a journo was too scared to write them, or a whistleblower wasn't game enough to come forward. It's not something you can quantify, but there's been other journos, big journos in this country interviewed about this, and they've said that, you know, in many ways it either dried up or people said, oh, well, I don't want to say anything after what happened to Annika and the ABC, and we're poorer for it. And more so for whistleblowers, for me, I think, you know, there's been some amazing research on whistleblowers by Griffith University, and they find that like 97% of them or something don't go to the media first. Usually they raise their issues internally. So if they work at a hospital and they see some wrongdoing or malpractice, they raise it with either colleagues or a boss or a line manager. Then often they go to, you know, a watchdog for their industry. And it's only when they're getting no response or no help that they decide to actually go, well, I'm going to talk to a journalist. You know, these people aren't just doing it because they want to cause trouble. Usually it's people that, you know, it's the standard you walk past, and they don't want to work for organisations that are doing the things that are happening. And they take a massive risk in speaking up. And other countries treat whistleblowers so differently to Australia. Like in many countries, they get financial rewards for calling out wrongdoing. We have this really anti-dobbing culture. We think people that squeal are sort of, they're squealers, and they're not one of us. They should just shut up and get along with everybody else and turn a blind eye, take the easy option. Not everybody's like that. I'm not accusing of all the listeners of being like that, but there is a real culture of that within workplaces that, you know, we don't like squeaky wheels. And that goes right to the top, that when people speak up and speak to journalists and try and raise issues, that they're often shut down and it's not worth the risk.
Oh, it's totally the case. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Queensland, where the entire arena of public administration and governance changed as a result of whistleblowers who came forward, triggering the Fitzgerald inquiry, triggering a major improvement in accountability and transparency in this state. You write about the former bank employee whose allegations about the bank triggered the Banking Royal Commission, which brought forward untold examples of corruption. There's the whistleblower from the Australian Tax Office. I mean, these people do, in the end, through their allegations, such good for democracy and transparency, yet their personal lives are completely ruined. I mean, that poor bank employee's life is ruined as a result of what he did.
We should make these people Australians of the Year, you know, and instead, Jeff Morris was an amazing example. And there was a government inquiry into whistleblowing, and he wrote this very moving statement. It's on Parliament's House website. You just Google APH and Jeff Morris and you can get it quite easily. About the toll it took and how his wife would say, I wish you never did this. And his son, you know, said, I just wish you were a dad, sort of not constantly trying to fight the Commonwealth Bank. The financial toll, people lose members of their family. Why are you so obsessed with this? Just give up, live a life. Just, you know, they often lose their job, their you know, which hits their income. The toll they take is immeasurable. And even if they get, you know, we got a Banking Royal Commission, which is wonderful, but that doesn't bring back everything that Jeff Morris has lost. And I just think, you know, when I got cleared only recently, I scanned through the letter. I got an email sent to me from the AFP with a letter attached. And I just scanned through it going, I want them to drop the investigation into any whistleblower or anyone I've spoken to. And it wasn't in the letter. And it wasn't until the AFP stood up and did a press conference hours later that they confirmed that. That to me was as important as what they did to me, if not more. Because if they had said, actually, we're not going after you anymore, Annika, because that's a bit too hard to go after a journalist, but we're going to go after some poor public servant who I've either spoken to or probably haven't. You know, the problem with Canberra is you play netball with people that are in the public service, you know them through so many different channels that I was just as worried they'd find the correct person as perhaps somebody I just knew and had called privately because we're friends, you know, and then they could be fingered for it. And it wouldn't have been a victory for me until they dropped that.
So your celebrations then about the decision to not continue with the prosecution would have been muted, presumably, by the fact that there are these other colleagues of yours who still awaiting that decision?
Look, I'm not going to lie, a personal victory. It was the first time I could relax. I knew there was a weight on my shoulders, and my workplace were very good and made me speak to a psychologist and a counsellor and make sure all was all good. But I was very upfront with anyone I was forced to talk to. I said, I know why I'm miserable. Until this goes away, I won't be happy again. No amount of talking to you is going to fix this, which I'm probably the worst sort of client ever. And look, they were very supportive, but I could see what the problem was. So even my partner said to me that he knew I was miserable, but until the charges were taken off, he said you cannot imagine the difference of how I walk around now compared to how I did a month ago. So it has been a huge personal victory, and we did drink champagne that night. Having said that, nothing that I went through for a year or two has changed the path for any journalist that follows me. And I guess that's what's worrying me. The whole time I kept thinking that, well, if they change the law because of me or something happens that stops somebody else going through this, then it's been worth it. And I don't see yet any substantial change. There is 2 inquiries into this at the moment, parliamentary inquiries. Fingers crossed something happens, because at the moment I seem to have won because the warrant was sloppy, and then when they got the chance to look through the text messages they took from my house, there was nothing there that they could hang a prosecution on. I fear for, I believe Sam Clark is who's one of the ABC journalists, isn't at risk anymore. It's just his colleague Dan, and I've spoken to Dan throughout this, as he's the only person that sort of knows what goes through your head. And I genuinely worry for everybody involved in that case. I hope for his sake and for my sake that there can be some sort of change out of this that brings, some sort of protection for journalists in the future, because we're not asking to be above the law, and it drives me insane when people ask that. I know it's a genuine question. I'm always happy to ask it, but other like democracies, the US, the UK, in the situation Australia is in. Australia is in a very unique position for a Western democracy, where journalists have to effectively break the law in order to do their jobs, and that's not the sort of country we should want to live in.
You've become a kind of reluctant poster girl for media freedom as a result of your ordeal. I don't suppose this is something you would ever imagined that you'd be doing several years ago.
No, but I guess the only good thing is I didn't want to be known as just the girl that wrote the Choppergate story that got rid of Bronwyn Bishop. I didn't want that to define my life, and for many years it did, and now this does. So I guess I got my wish in that way. Look, I fought it for a while. I didn't want to be known for this. I didn't want to write first-person pieces. I didn't want to write a book. I didn't want to be interviewed. My work would make me get photos. And I said, no, I don't want to. And I was very recalcitrant.
Yeah.
I think about 3 months in, I realised I didn't have a choice. It probably took my brain a little bit of time to catch up after what had happened. And it was like, you've been put in this situation, so at least make the most out of it and talk about it. And maybe a fire will start in somebody's belly. And I understand how hard it is for the general public to care about press freedom, because prior to my case, I didn't care much for it either. I thought I lived in Australia and we have a free and fair press and I can write whatever I wanted. And that is not the case. And there's so many things to worry about in this world at the moment. I don't even, I don't expect to get sympathy, but it's an issue that really does need the public to get behind. And I think as a profession, we've done a terrible job of explaining to punters why we should matter. We often get judged by the worst people in our professions.
Yeah.
And we should get scrutiny, and we do things wrong. But having a free press, the benefit you get from that as a country is so much stronger than the stupid mistakes some journos make. And I think because we've become, I guess, used to having this situation, we're thankfully not living in a dictatorship, that we've failed to understand the role that a properly functioning media can give to a democracy. And unfortunately, cases like mine and Dan's and Sam's has brought that back into the light, and I wish it never had to happen. But if this can do anything, it can maybe rev up the public to fight for it.
Well, it worries me, actually, the public attitude towards journalism and the public apathy towards the erosion.
I'd say hatred even over apathy.
Well, the hatred toward journalists, I think that's right, but the apathy toward the rollback of their liberties. I remember when the first tranche of new security laws got passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I was hosting a national talkback program, and these were big stories, big issues, at least for us at Radio National they were. And so we would debate them. Very often we'd get experts on to talk about, look, if we allow these laws, these are the implications of them. And then we'd push it out to talk back. And I was just never convinced that the public cared very much about that. Now, of course, since then, there have been scores of additional laws that have been passed, the things that were normally just assumed to be basic liberties and freedoms in a democracy have gone by the wayside. I mean, how do you judge this, the public mood toward this kind of thing?
I feel exactly the same as you. And I think there is a real, well, if I've done nothing wrong, what have I got to hide attitude. And I understand the sentiment behind that. And as I say, we have been lucky enough not to have a major terror attack on our soil. And much of that is because of, I guess, the laws we've introduced. But there's been more than 60 national security laws and amendments introduced in Australia since September 11. That's more than in any other like country, like Western democracy. And I think we should probably start to ask questions about that. Now, the flip side of that is you say, well, we've been lucky. You know, England and America have had terror attacks since, and we've been pretty lucky in that sense. I get that. But if we're giving up freedoms to get that extra safety, we need to have much more rigorous debates around that. And often we don't. The way politics is done in this country, and people are wedged, you know, you often see the coalition do it to Labor. If you dare question the need for this, you're pro-terrorist.
Yep.
Effectively. It's
unpatriotic, yeah.
And people might say that that's a blight on the coalition for putting Labor in that position, but I think it can be just as critical of Labor for this, because they should fight harder. They shouldn't be put in this position. They shouldn't be wedged on that if they believe in freedom. So I think both parties have some explaining to do on that. Giving up freedoms is fine if you understand what you're giving up. There are checks and balances. There's transparency. But the problem with spy agencies is there's no transparency. In every other country, you can FOI, you can get freedom of information. You can use that act to get information on your national security agencies. They're not even mentioned in our FOI Act. They're excluded from that. There are so many reasons that they operate in the shadows, and I think they use that. It's very easy for them to argue that, saying, well, we keep you safe. You know, you can't know what we know. It's very important information. And whilst I'm sure that's the case, why don't we have an independent judge decide that? Why don't we have some sort of better transparency around what goes on, what we can know, and have better public fights about this? It's very easy for the government to say, well, we're going after pedophiles, so therefore we all hate pedophiles, we want them to go to jail, and if you don't, well, then you're pro-pedophile. But that's such a simplistic debate around this, and that's not how it works.
Are there specific reforms, specific improvements that you would like to see that would give greater protection to journalists as a result of what you've gone through?
So many. Where do I begin? A public right to know. And that's not what the public's interested in. Let me, just point that out. This is often a debate in journalism. Is it the public's right to know, or is it in the public interest? Well, a common one they often use is sex scandals, the Barnaby Joyce scandal, for instance. Does it matter if Barnaby Joyce has had an extramarital affair? Well, does it affect his business, as a minister, I guess is the sort of argument. We're here to scrutinise that side of his life. These arguments come up often, but I think if we're talking in national security and it becomes a public's right to know, politicians work for us, they do things in our name, and we should know what they're up to. So I think that test would be amazing and introduced to all national security laws. FOI is a hot mess. If you've ever tried to use freedom of information to get any information in Australia, you will find that there is rule after rule after rule about what they can release, and they use it, and you often get pages and pages back. I saw this in Victoria recently around the hotel quarantine or the Cedar Meats outbreak in Victoria, and it was just black page after black page after black page. You can't know that because it's sensitive. There's no way all that information is sensitive, and nor should it be, because it's done in our name with our money that we give them every week. So we're entitled to know this. They use big words to try and make it seem official, but we should know that information. The other one is classification. And one minister said to me at the time, a coalition minister, he said, "Oh, Annika, some of the stuff that comes across my desk as a minister is akin to the same importance as my shopping list. And yet it's got top secret on it." Because the moment it gets that stamp, then if it's leaked, there has to be an investigation. And they often use the example of sprinkling something with cabinet dust. You walk pages and pages of files through the cabinet room, and all of a sudden it's a cabinet document. Doesn't even matter if they read it, and it becomes an official document, and it can't be released for 30 years effectively. So we need an overhaul of our classification system. Look, defamation is a whole nother hot mess in Australia, and it's a state-based thing, so it's even worse. But
what about the right to challenge a warrant against a journalist before a raid is conducted?
That would be wonderful. They can do that in England. That's something that would have saved a lot of time and money in my case, and I'm sure it'll come out one day. But in my case, the government solicitor challenged us. So News Corp, my employer, paid our legal fees, and the government solicitor, the taxpayer, went to the High Court to challenge me. Now, that's a very expensive process that the taxpayers paid for, and we've ended up winning that, and there's a chance they'll have to pay, as happens, legal fees for that. So the amount of money that the taxpayer has paid to have my warrant challenged is absurd, and people should be very upset about that. One thing that could have fixed that is if we could have challenged it before that. And everyone said, well, you would have got rid of all the top secret things in your house, Annika. Given they came around a year later and wanted to look in my bin, I hadn't just, thrown out a bunch of notes the day before. Yeah. I don't know what they thought I was hiding in my grill or my freezer, but that's what they searched through. So I've always argued that should have I been a massive national security risk, they probably would have come around the next day after publication. It took them a year. So, that one, yes, it's such an easy fix to allow journalists to challenge a warrant early doors. And, instead it's a lengthy and expensive court process yep. and often picked up by the taxpayer.
Would you think twice about pursuing a story about national secrets or some other similar matter in the future that may place you in a similar position again?
Oh, Paul, I hate this question because so much of me wants to say, yep, I just want to go work for Gardening Australia or, Vogue Living and do that sort of journalism. And at one stage, one of my parents said to me, there's a lot of jobs in journalism. Why didn't you write sport? Or, why didn't you write for a House and Land magazine or something like that, real estate? And I have challenged myself in that a lot. So part of me says, wouldn't have gone through it. That's very different than when as you started the show, you said, when a journalist gets a story and you get excited about it and it's going to be a big story, you can't stop, If something comes across your desk, and let's put it that way, it's not as simple as coming across your desk, but if you get a tidbit and you think there's a story here, it's in your blood and you chase it. And so should I come across something again, of course, I'm going to pursue it. But I guess I'm not as naive now. I know that that might result in a visit from the police.
Yeah. Look, just one more before I hand back to Chrissy. She may have some questions from the online audience. Been great talking to you, Annika. Are you enjoying journalism now? You're back to it. Is it, walking through the door at work, does it fill you with the same joy that clearly it did 2 or 3 years ago, or has some of the edge gone off the job?
The same joy, no. It's hard. I hated going into Parliament House for a long time. Having said that, when I get a good yarn or when I have a good interview or I get a sort of a new angle on a story or the adrenaline rush of sort of filing and I still get a rise out of it and a rush. And they always say that if you don't like seeing your byline on a story or you no longer start looking up your yarn the next day, then you've probably lost it. And there was times there where I didn't want to read the newspapers. But no, I still enjoy telling a good yarn and writing it and chasing it. So the fire is there somewhere. It's just, it's taken a big hit. Yeah.
Well, look, I know how you feel. I mean, we're both journalists. We both know what that feeling is,
yes.
As subdued as it may be at the moment. Great to talk to you, Annika. An incredible ordeal. Good to see that you're smiling and able to look back on it with some sense of perspective, but also with some sense of clarity about the important challenges that we still need to fight. Great to talk to you. The little book, is called On Secrets by Annika Smethurst. Avid reader are selling copies of it. Great to talk to you, Annika. All the best.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
I'll hand back to you, Chrissy, at Avid Reader.
Thank you very much, Paul Barclay. That was a fascinating conversation, and we've got a few questions actually, so I'll just quickly ask you a couple, Annika.
Please.
One of them is, was writing this book a little bit therapeutic for you?
Yes. Now, when I said my house was raided and the news got out very quickly, I think if the cops arrived at about 9, by about 10, a book publisher had called me, and my mind wasn't quite in the frame of this is going to be a book. I was still like, this is only going to be a small thing. It's just going to be one day and I'm just going to move on with my life. While book publishers could see the enormity of it, I still couldn't at 10 a.m. standing in my kitchen. That was Louise Adler, and I did end up doing the book with Hachette through her. So look, I fought it for a long time. I was not going to write a book. Journalists mostly hate writing about themselves, hate being the story, love writing about other people. So this was a hard task to turn that sort of microscope on me and to know that this was going to be published and my story was going to be out there. But after about 6 months of this year that I've lived, I realised I wasn't going to win this one. That story was being out there, being told by people that had no idea. I used to get very frustrated when I saw people that I'd never met talking about me on television and my case. So I thought, well, I may as well write about it. And yeah, I found the process in the end, it felt like closure. And the book came out the week that the AFP dropped the charges. So it did feel like an end. You know, I could put the book away, the charges were going to be dropped, and I could move on with my life.
Fantastic. I'm so glad.
Me too.
That's great. Look, there's a question from Tracy who says, do you worry about the shrinking media sector at the moment and therefore the lack of scrutiny by journalists on government?
Oh, so much, Tracy. That's an amazing question. And look, I know people have different favourite newspapers or reporters or favourite radio stations, and I don't really care who you like. You know, I have people that love what I do and people hate what I do, and it doesn't really bother me if you keep it civil. It's voices are what's important. You know, I always say to people, if you agree with a reporter or a newspaper or a radio station, listen to that and then go and listen to the opposite view. You know, it should be about, you should be able to challenge yourself. And increasingly we're just living in echo chambers, whether that be in Twitter or on radio, where you just want to reinforce your ideas. And I think the best thing we can have is a million different voices, left, right, centre, young people. You know, BuzzFeed is a great one. They aim at a younger audience, older audiences. I don't really care what your genre is or what your niche is. It worries me so much that we're losing newspapers, and especially in regional areas. I grew up in a regional area. I wrote for a regional newspaper. I know Queensland has lost a number of newspapers recently. The business model is drying up. People don't buy newspapers anymore. And whenever people say it's a tragedy, I always say to them, well, when did you buy the last newspaper? And very regularly people tell me they don't buy newspapers anymore. And much of that is they say, oh, well, I don't like what's in them anymore. And I get that, but it's cyclical. If we have a good business model and we have money, we can employ more journalists, write better stories, have more resources. If we don't, then it's harder to do that job. You know, newspapers used to have an aviation reporter, and Parliament House used to be full with journalists. I work in the News Corp office there, which takes in, you know, the Courier and the Herald Sun and the Weekly Times. We used to have a Wall Street Journal reporter, the Australian, and it's almost halved in the time I've been there in just 5 or 6 years, and it's not alone in that. So it's a great tragedy. I don't know how to fix it. Buying newspapers is one thing, but it doesn't solve the problem. And of course, COVID has just spread this up. A lot of our, you know, in country towns, we rely on small businesses to take ads in newspapers, and all of a sudden they're not doing that. So yeah, it's terrifying.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a very, very different landscape somewhere at the end of this COVID situation. Look, we do have a couple of other questions, but we have run out of time. So I think that we'll just we'll
email me.
Well, yeah,
my email is publicly available. Google it.
Fantastic. Look, it's been really wonderful listening to this, and we will be able to re-listen to this on Big Ideas, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad that we were here, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it so much, and for everybody for coming along tonight.
Excellent. Thanks, Annika. Thanks,
Bye.
Paul. See you later. Bye.
Yeah, we're done.